Today's book presents a different approach to enterprise strategy and leadership, a complementary approach the author calls pioneering leadership. Rather than simply work within existing parameters of operational excellence, pioneering leadership sees you embarking upon quests. Such quests allow us to systematically explore complex and uncertain futures. We don't set goals in the hopes that a particular future will manifest. Rather, we explore multiple futures and prepare proactive stratagems to capitalize on each. Pioneering leadership is challenging to initiate and maintain, especially when compared to the established approach that favors fast results with a bias towards prudence and predictability. But if we can crack through our default thinking, pioneering leadership offers enterprise leaders the chance to obtain the most important thing of all: enduring relevance. It is a great pleasure to welcome author of How to Lead a Quest, a handbook for pioneering executives, the arch wizard of ambiguity himself, Dr. Jason Fox. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's very good to be here. Nice to hear those words. Because How to Lead a Quest was written a few years ago now, so it's kind of cool to kind of hear this and think, oh yeah, that's actually, because when I immediately after writing it, I'm just filled with criticism and loathing. It's like, because it always can be so much better. But now that I've had a little bit of distance, so that's not too bad. So thank you, lovely intro.
And for you, our audience, so the book was published in 2016. I have a copy up for grabs, and I'm so happy because Dr. Jason Fox does a magnificent job of being your Sherpa on a quest. I absolutely love the book. I ate it up, and I selected a pin that often goes with each show. Today's pin is a backpack for the quest, but it says something very meaningful that is actually at the heart of the show, Jason, and also the heart of this book. It says, do more than exist. And you had your own little pin story.
Yeah. When we launched the book, we had a limited run of hardcover copies that my wife illustrated. She's the illustrator of the book as well. And we had hand-drawn illustrations, and she also made special pins that we sent out to some of the early pre-orders that we got. So we might still have some around. And if I can find one, I'll send you out. There's a wizard hat pin, a fox pin, and a few other things. So I'll figure out how to get it into the post to you.
And I was delighted I told you about the pins. I often don't even refer to it, but it just shows you we're on the same frequency, man, same vibration.
Pins are where it's at. I love it, yeah. The world of pins, once you get into it, you start finding yourself on Etsy and you're looking at all these like amazing pin designs. It's like, yeah, I'm with you.
Oh, man, I've been there. I've wasted many hours that I should be on a meaningful quest.
That's great.
Back to the book. So you start the book by exploring default thinking, the curse of efficiency, and the delusion of progress. You also reviewed the default growth arc of an enterprise and discover how great businesses can one day wake up and discover they're no longer relevant. Maybe let's start with, as you do in the book, the idea of constructive discontent.
Yeah, constructive discontent. I really like the framing. I did a PhD in motivation and behavior change, and it came up in an academic paper. I can't remember the original authors, but the coinage is beautiful. Constructive discontent. It's I think there's a pattern here with any approach to leadership, motivation, behavior change, or even just setting up the premise for a book. In business speak, it's either you've got a burning platform, where shit's got to change, or you've got a burning aspiration. And the issue is, if you don't have either a burning platform or a burning aspiration, the risk is that you're coasting along and you get stagnation, you get complacency, you get this kind of situation where people are busy, they're being productive, boxes are being ticked, you're making incremental improvements within existing paradigms, you look at your performance compared to last year and everything seems fine, and you don't realize that you're busily working yourself to a space where you may wake up to find you're no longer relevant. And that's probably that's kind of what I'd call the delusion of progress, where people spend so much time busily working themselves towards irrelevance. Meaningful progress is a different story. But this constructive discontent, none of that stuff, like I've learned with this stuff, I mean, it's this classic sales strategy, right? No one's really interested in the solution until they realize how much pain they're in and the implications of not doing anything and the implications of choosing to not choose to do anything. So constructive discontent is a useful framing. And so I guess the start of the book, and I guess what I want all people to realize is that, if you're feeling frustrated about something, chances are there is a better way. And the more that we can dial up that sense of frustration and channel it in a constructive way. Many people are very good at being discontent. Constructive discontent is where it's at. It's okay to be content too. I once experienced about 6 consecutive seconds of happiness, and that was lovely. But if we're content for too long, that just leads to comfort and complacency. And so it reminds me, there's this guy I know who works at a large software company. His internal title is the chief agitator. Like, he just goes to teams that seem a little too settled and stirs things up, just to see what emerges. And I find that's a useful kind of constructive discontent. So yeah, the book starts with constructive discontent. It's a useful frame.
I love that. It reminded me of George Bernard Shaw has a quote that all progress starts with the unreasonable man or woman. So this idea that if you lean into that, like, because I often find this, and I say it on the show, is that often leadership in an organization is so focused on today and the next quarterly result that when somebody comes along and they're a gainsayer, they get framed and they get labeled as a naysayer, and then actually they're usually on death row. They're usually on the green mile in some way, either internally themselves or the organization does that to them, because they're like going, I don't want to know, and stop agitating.
Change is threatening. And this comes back to the default thinking, right? We all have our defaults. They're the options we choose automatically in the absence of viable alternatives. And most of us live and learn and grow via pattern recognition. So we start to form defaults. They're the basis of our ontological disposition towards life. It's how we make meaning. And it makes sense. Like, you want to have your defaults. And in business, you want defaults at least 80% of the time. It's good. If you're going to hire someone, chances are you've hired them before, so you've got some templates or some policies, rules, systems, procedures, and default ways of doing things. My worry, though, is many organizations have become cursed with efficiency, and so they're kind of just engulfed by default thinking. And then if you think about if someone is a gainsayer, if someone has some ideas that things could be different or things could be better, that's all a threat to the default ways of doing things, because our defaults are quick, they're familiar, they're minimal cognitive burden. And the fact is, we're all so busy nowadays, or at least many people feel that they are. And when you're busy, you're time poor. And we're having so much screen time at the moment. And with the geographical distribution of many companies, it's the hours that we're making contact with teammates all across the day. And this results into a psychophysiologically low state. And so therefore people will become a little bit more selfish and self-centered and myopic and kind of more inclined to protect rather than collaborate, to productively tick boxes as opposed to explore what's beyond the boxes. And that's at the heart of this curse of efficiency that I mentioned. And I think day to day, it always resonates. People recognize it, but we really need to dial up this constructive discontent, because the way we're working, to quote, I'm sure someone said this, the way we're working isn't working. It just isn't working.
You dig here a little bit deeper, and this obviously is why, because you've done this PhD in workplace motivation and your previous book, The Game Changer, as well, which comes out here, like you've built upon that work, but you dig a bit deeper at default thinking. You go into the idea of patterns, templates, systems, norms, and precedents. Maybe let's give a top line, if you can remember all of those, on each of those, because I think actually just even being aware of those makes people spot them during the day, and I think that's the first place to start.
Patterns, systems, norms, defaults, templates, like these are all different kind of cognitive frames, and this is really tricky. I mean, The Game Changer was actually a lot more popular of a book than How to Lead a Quest.
Wow.
but I love How to Lead a Quest so much more. And this is
Same here, by the way.
Thank you.
Same here.
This is going to sound
Loved it.
incredibly arrogant, what I'm going to say. I'm going to sound like a royal prick. The difference is, I think, a lot of the How to Lead a Quest requires metacognition. So you have to be able to think about what you're thinking about. You have to kind of have a metasystemic perspective, which means that you need to be able to lift yourself outside of the systems that you work within. Whereas the Game Changer was more for managers of teams working within the system to optimize within. And I think honestly, I don't think everyone can do that very easily. Some of us, it does come a little bit more naturally, but others, it starts to get into a domain it's tricky for folks to wrap their head around. So, but when it clicks, when you become construct aware, when you start to see patterns, when you start to see the systems, the defaults, the templates, the rules, the operating system of the way we work, it's kind of akin to seeing the matrix. You kind of see that. It's like when you realize that money isn't real, but it is. It's kind of like it's got this both and paradoxical quality. Money itself is an intersubjective meme, a unit, it's a symbol of trust and stuff that's kind of based upon multiple people believing in it, and it's very, very strong. And so therefore it's rarefied, and it's more real than other things. And yet still, it's of a. I'm going on a massive tangent here. I guess what I'm saying here
Good, man. Good. On a quest.
Well, yeah, I guess what we're
Cognitive
saying
quest.
There's a lot of stuff that just has existed in enterprises that maybe emerged in an executive meeting 10 years ago, and then it became enshrined in policy, and then it became embedded into default patterns and behaviors, and then became part of the training manual as people were inducted, and the original leaders have since left, and then it's just the way that we do things. And for many people, they just stop seeing it. And I mean, this is related to why it's such a golden window before you become inoculated into a new enterprise ecosystem. When a new recruit or a new leader comes to a new organization, the stuff that they see and notice, all the naive questions they ask, why do we do this? Why is it like that? That is gold, because that helps to shine a light on the stuff that people aren't seeing anymore. All the patterns, the systems, the templates, the defaults that, the busy executives are just blind to because of their day-to-day demands.
I love that, man. Have you ever heard of the zero story? Have you ever heard that story?
No.
Okay, well, I'll share this with you.
Oh, is it like not seeing, yeah, tell me. This is mathematics, right?
No. It's actually so very quickly, and I'm just going to join you down this rabbit hole that we've gone down. So basically, it's about that, questioning things. So a consultant, Jason Fox and Aidan McCullen, comes into an organization, and they notice that the organization have this strange ritual that they just go through. And what it was every day there's a daily report.
What a great name. Jason and Aidan.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Having a ritual, but it's the wrong one. And we'll come back to rituals at the end of the show. But the idea was that at the end of every day, they'd submit a report, and the top right there was the figure 0. So 0 was written, and a consultant comes along and he goes, "What's the 0 bit?" And they go, "Oh, I don't know. We've always done that." And he goes digging and goes looking through, and it's in the UK. Goes digging through old papers, ends up in a file room, kind of like that ad. Do you remember the old Carlsberg complaint ads? Like there's never anything happening in there, covered in dust. Finds this box of files, goes through it, and finds the original report. And the original report on the top right had said, "Number of bomb attacks today, 0." And somebody just kept writing this. And in time, the writing faded away, but the 0 stayed. And they just kept the ritual going. And I use it as this kind of idea that that's what happens in organizations on a wide scale. But we don't see them anymore because they're just what we've always done. I'm sure you've loads of stories of that type of thing.
I do. And it gets to the point where I'm realizing it's actually... it's a little bit dangerous and not very good for business for some of the things that I'm pointing out, because the fundamental issues with a lot of the operating systems of enterprises is they're propped up via the incentives of the executives that keep it all flowing. It's a really tricky bind, and it takes a very special person who's worked their way into a position of influence and authority that recognizes that the system itself needs to change. And that is freaking hard. Let alone then bringing in externals like you or I to help in that process. Like that is a very rare person. And even then, the quest to transition or literally transform an organization, like this whole transformation buzzword, like for many enterprises, it's this. I mean, the last 5 years has been transformation, digital transformation. I mean, COVID's done a better job of digital transformation than many CTOs and CIOs. But anyway, the thing is, transformation is the superposition between creativity and destruction. And what happens in most organizations is they're good at saying yes to new things, flavor of the month, let's do this, let's add this, and webinar here and there. But when it comes to destroying things that are no longer serving them, that's where it gets really, really tricky. And that's where many large enterprises are in such a bind. And so everything becomes a quagmire and it takes so much effort to do anything. And it's, I think a lot of, we need to set the torch to a lot of things that have served us well in the past, but aren't serving us for where we need to go.
Yeah. And you dedicate time to that at the end of the book as well, like going, well, if you're going to do this, if you find these alternatives, you're going to have to create space for them because you often don't have time for them. So time to pull out the torch and start setting things alight. But I wanted to get into something because you mentioned there about, the changes we've witnessed over the last 5 years or so. We've certainly witnessed change over the last 2 years. And one of those places is in workplace. And you hear a lot about, and you see this a lot when you email people, there's a lot of people out of office on a Friday or a Monday, and they're either working a 3 or 4 day work week now. And in some cases, if they haven't been furloughed or hopefully they haven't been let go in their jobs, it's a case that they actually are on 4 days now and they're getting paid for 5. And I often think that a better way, or maybe an alternative way, would be to use that 5th day for learning or for examining your defaults or for some way to look towards the future of the organization. And I say that to say, I pulled a quote from the book because you say the goal is that we spend a good 20% of our time engaged in more meaningful and thoughtful work. We'd reflect upon our assumptions and decisions we make. We'd feed our hunches and nurture the exploration of new possibilities and options. Now, we see this time and time again with the literature. Some people like Alex Osterwalder, a friend of the show, will say up to 40% of your time should be spent there. But 20% is a day a week. And that's a lot of people, it's hard enough to get people in a room to do a workshop with them at all for 1 day a year, let alone 1 day a week.
Yeah, I mean, the 20% thing's become a little bit too popularized, I think, nowadays, that it's almost become its own default in some ways. You say the 20%, and in my experience, people are like, oh yeah, the Google 20% thing or something. They kind of, they quickly collapse it into, oh, it means this. I like that pushback from Alex about could be 40%. I think the thing is, I asked this question a lot. I don't think many, in my experience, I don't think many senior leaders are reading books. I don't think they're reading science fiction. I don't think they're having long conversations, just exploring possibilities with friends. I don't think they're going for long walks. I don't think they're journaling and reflecting. I think they're burning themselves out. They're, this is the thing, when change is, all the ambiguity that we're moving into, it's absolutely apprehensive. Like very few people have the negative capability to thrive in ambiguity, complexity, paradox, and doubt. And so what happens then is they'll default to the things that provide a rich sense of progress. And this is where you get leaders go to manager mode, where they start meddling in stuff that probably isn't what they should be doing. That's not, it's not them, being visionary, crafting the strategy, moving the organization towards future relevance, and keeping the team. It's instead it's them, jumping into email and checking it. And I don't think that's as helpful. And so my provocation here is that we need to have some sort of return where there is space for emergence. If I was to write How to Lead a Quest again, I would probably dedicate a large chunk at the start towards cultivating senius, this notion of collective genius, which I think Kevin Kelly coined a while ago. This sense of, having the time and space and the environment where you can actually think in draft and you can build on ideas and nurture divergent and emergent thinking. And most organizations just simply don't have that. One of the most phenomenal books for me that I read a couple of years ago is a book called How to Do Nothing by Jenny Odell, which is
who's it by?
Jenny Odell.
Jenny, okay. Stick it down in the list.
Resistance in the attention economy. It's really, really hard, and leaders are spread thin, and the quests aren't even possible. It's just a cute phrase if someone's just going to be, let's do a quest, and they dedicate all of 20 minutes a week to it. It's just doesn't work like that. So that's been my lesson. There's been a few that have taken it on board, but that then requires the organization to be in a fairly healthy state with at least some profit margin or at least some forward-thinking vision to dedicate time and space for it. But a lot of large organizations are kind of scrambling for very small margins and having to cut costs, and that's a tricky space for many folks to be in.
I get it, man. I've worked in those organizations, and I see nobody gives you a pat on the back for it. It's more likely to be a kick in the backside for exploring and for making guesses of what the future might be. No matter how well you've examined those and how many alternatives you've come up with in order to back one, nobody's going, well done. They're more likely to go, well, you wasted X amount of money, and I have a practice. One of my weekly rituals myself is to write a weekly article, and I was inspired by yours, and I started thinking about how, if a kid, right? So a kid, you want your kid to unpack the dishwasher or learn how to clean up their spilled milk, right? And I was thinking about, right, so your kid spills milk, and that's fine, and you're kind of going, okay, well, it's a weekend. Okay, so what you do is you clean the milk, but then you need to wash the counter so there's no smell, whatever, right? So you take the time. But now the kid spills the milk when you're on the way out the door to an important meeting, or you're running up to do a Zoom call to do a meeting upstairs, and your reaction is totally different. So you have this outcome bias. And I was like, that's what happens in organizations, particularly because the leadership are under so much pressure. They have so little time. Maybe they're already on a burning platform. And that's the equivalent of, I'm actually okay with you spilling milk in the pursuit of learning or new experiments, but not when it's in this context of me being in a massive rush. And that's a huge problem.
It compounds, because leadership exists in a highly political environment. So there's all sorts of power dynamics. It's just like what we see with social media. There's not really as much room for contemplation or nuance or taking the time to understand different perspectives because we're all so busy. And this is coupled with an obscene metric obsession, like just people are fixated upon numbers, and anything that can be collapsed into something that's measurable, what gets measured is what gets done. It just blinkers our focus. And so, and the thing about numbers and measuring against numbers, you have to kind of predetermine what the outcome is before you even explored. And then you've got this kind of arbitrary benchmark that you established before you had the wisdom of whatever you gain on a quest or through the exploration that you have to measure yourself against. Where I've seen it work well is where teams have the maturity enough to integrate qualitative analysis and reflection, which is, it's still, in my perspective, very rigorous. It allows a much richer information source of meaning making and sense making. And it complements the quantitative data quite nicely and can address some of the gaps that may be in there. So where you get attuned to the vibes and what's emerging and what people are sensing that's out there. And that's kind of where the elements of immense strategic advantage and possibility and risk mitigation emerges from, is those that are attuned and have the space to kind of be able to sense make, and then share and make meaning with the folks around them. But yeah, you and I see this, right? This innovation thing. It's like it's rife with buzzwords and all sorts of folks promising quick fixes, and they've got this, out of a box, 5-step linear plan to get your things innovative. And if for anyone that's been in the game longer than a few years, you just like see it's not that easy. If it were that easy, people would be doing it.
Yeah.
So
and it's rife with all types of monsters, which we'll talk about in a second when I introduce the Kraken of Doom. And by the way, I love your language throughout the book. I love the language on your website. It's clear that you love language, you love words, and you mentioned that throughout the book. But I wanted to zone in on something that you said there, because here's a scenario, and I've been here. New idea, you've done your research, you're going, there's something in this. CFO comes along, and the CFO is not the Kraken of Doom, by the way. They often are. They're some type of monster, but not often. But the CFO goes, okay, when will this be profitable? And you're like going, I don't know, maybe 18 months, maybe 24, and that's not good enough. It needs to be 12. And you're kind of going, and just to get a yes, you'll go, sure. And you'll go, I'll deal with that problem when it comes. But then 12 months later, as you say, you've learned a lot. You're kind of going, it's not exactly what we thought it would be, but we've got something way better. I need more time. I need more people. I need more energy and resources. And the CFO then says to the CEO, Aidan's lost it. I don't know if he's on target anymore. He's costing us money. We're bonused on EBITDA. We're bonused on that. Why would we have an Aidan in the company? Oh yeah, good call. Then all of a sudden you start looking out for errors by an Aidan in the company or that type of person, and that person's on death row, and you see it time and time and time again. And these great people who are game changers in their organization are on death row and often leave themselves because they're starved of resource and energy and support,
totally.
or else they just are they're fired.
Yeah, and a new flavor of the month comes in with a kind of new buzzword packaging that's still the same shitty concept, but like it just seems attractive but different. I have noticed that like familiarity breeds contempt, and there is certainly something to be said around ebbs and flows to engagement and involvement. And yeah, the whole CFO, I think it's critical to get skeptical folks on side early and in a way that's intelligent. And as much as it's been memed up and, taken out of proportion, as all good things are in this industry, I do think Eric's lean startup, minimum viable product approach holds a lot of ground, so it might not be profitable in a big way, but yeah, we can gain some momentum and insight doing some, safe to fail experiments and gain an insight into some domain. I mean, here's the thing though, you don't want to commit to a particular experiment in a particular track before actually exploring what the viable alternative options might be. And so with the quest thing, it takes what I call a quest augmented strategy, takes a different level of maturity of it's not already jumping to a solution that someone else has researched and found. It's doing some of the work that others may not have even contemplated yet.
And as you say, including people on that quest, so they become more embedded in it. They give their diverse opinions. Their neurodiversity comes into play. All those things are so important. Yeah. I wanted to come back to some of the mental models that you offer throughout the book, because one of them, one of the ones many people on the show will be familiar with are the S curves of growth throughout an organization. But you actually introduce a lovely one, which is the rainbow of growth and despair. And here you say, just to encapsulate everything we've been saying here, we likely find an embedded fixation upon near-term KPIs and shareholder returns. There is no sense of greater purpose. People fixate upon ever-shrinking margins and seek greater efficiencies. Then you share some of the common challenges. So this is what you do next. You share some of the common challenges within organizations. 1, a distinct lack of ownership exists. 2, vision is blinkered and myopic. 3, failure, as we said, like the spilled milk, carries the stigma. Friction seems to exist for every action, and everybody is busy. And at the other side of the rainbow of growth and then despair lies the inevitable creature, the Kraken of Doom. I'd love if you to bring us on this, unpack those mental models, the rainbow and then the Kraken.
Yes, the rainbow. I mean, here's the thing. I just, where possible, let's language it up. Let's make this distinct and memorable. And just because it's a business book doesn't mean we can't, engage our imaginations. So an arc, the default arc of enterprise growth, the rainbow of growth and despair. Like, it all starts at the startup phase or something like that, where new thinking is the most valuable commodity. If this new thinking meets a market need, one can expect things will grow. Very often it doesn't, so nothing happens. Sometimes it's very hard to scale a small team into a larger team, so nothing happens. But say it does, you enter this growth phase. An interesting thing happens between growth and maturity. This is where curiosity begins to die, because at this point in time, you have a raft of evidence that suggests that what you're currently doing is working, so why would you do anything differently? You have policies, rules, systems, templates, default ways of doing things. And, it's like, why are you reading a book, or why are you going off to that conference not related to this industry? We've got shit to do. Let's get back to work. And so people become busier and become cursed with efficiency, and we get all those issues that we were saying before. And then there comes a time where one day people begin to realize, we have missed a very important opportunity in the last few years, and we're on a track to be not relevant at all. And our options are pretty slim. We can maybe buy a license to a product that someone else has done. We could maybe, I guess we might get bought out by someone it's just like it starts to dwindle. And that's where we find ourselves in the inevitable Kraken of Doom, which feeds upon the sweet nectar of your impending irrelevance. And no one sets out to become irrelevant, but many well-intended leaders and teams find themselves there when they become too busy for meaningful progress. And this notion of being too busy for meaningful progress drives me nuts, but it's just what I see everywhere. The Kraken of Doom is my metaphor for disruption. The Kraken, it's kind of hidden. You don't see it. It exists in liquid, which is fluid, so therefore not fixed. You can't really point to it. And once it gets its tentacles around your ship, it's pretty hard to escape getting pulled under. So yeah, that's the mental model there.
Beautiful. I was what I was mentioning to you before we came on, that I was trying to choose a pin, and I have a pin of a rainbow, but it's a happy story rainbow. There's very few, I'm sure, pins out there where you're like, there's a Kraken at the end or some type of monster. Yeah, that's right.
Not a pot of gold, a Kraken. Well, I mean, so the point of that model there is you can jump onto new arcs at any point in time. You don't have to kind of follow it all the way through to the Kraken. Just get onto a new rainbow. But what does that mean? It means we need to cultivate time, space, and the environment where new thinking can flourish. And that's the biggest threat to organizations as I see it at the moment. There just isn't time to think. Leaders are so busy. And even if there is time to think, the environments are so competitive, so metric driven, so myopic, that any new thinking kind of struggles to emerge. But, if we zoom back even further, outside of the context of an organization, it's fine, because innovation is emerging in all sorts of places. Like there's things happening in Web3 with blockchain and decentralized anonymous teams that are going to completely eat and consume the traditional world, which is very, very fascinating to be witnessing at the moment. But that's probably a story for another time. There's still hope for organizations who quest. So maybe we rally back to that.
So yeah, let's come back to the word quest itself, because I mentioned your love of language that comes throughout the book, and indeed in talking to you here. And we've kind of covered the constructive discontent so far, the why would you bother going on a quest in the first time. But then part two, and by the way, there's 6 parts to the book. Part 2, we're only in part 2, by the way, is about the what. So this is like, why the quest? Why a quest augmented strategy? And I'd love here, because we think of the word quest means voyage or journey, but it actually has a very meaningful reason you chose that word. And I'll just tee you up here, because you say, by seeking to reduce uncertainty instead of questing with it, we end up reducing the very things that allow us to pioneer, unlock game-changing strategic innovation, creativity, serendipity, imagination, diversity, experimentation, and learning. I absolutely love that line. I pulled that one out. But perhaps you'll tell us Why quest? Why you chose that word?
I mean, there's a part of me, the philosopher and poet and artist, that just loves the mythology of quest and what it means. Every question literally begins with a quest, and we live in a world that seeks answers, quick fixes, ready answers. We tend to favor high conviction, so people that are literally convicts to their beliefs. And I'd rather that we lean into uncertainty, that we cultivate a love for the generative ambiguity, for what might be possible beyond the known. And so, I mean, quest has a clinical definition as well, as the search for viable alternative options that meet cognitive criteria. And that pairs very well with this default thinking that we we're talking about before. Our defaults are the options we choose automatically in the absence of viable alternatives. So if we want to go beyond the default, we need to find viable alternative options. The quest is a search for viable alternative options beyond the default. And so if we are questing, like we start off on a quest, we don't know what the goal is. I mean, so much as business is goal driven. It's like, what do you want to achieve and what's your SMART goal for it and how are we going to measure it? You kind of, whereas, I guess in some ways you could think of much of business is driven via a mission-oriented mindset. You get Olympian speakers or military speakers come in and they'll say, we had a clear goal and we just focused on that goal, and every day we knew exactly the target that we wanted to hit and we trained hard. And the thing about, Olympians are amazing at what they do, and the Olympic metaphors work tremendously well in fixed environments because that's what the Olympics are. There's it's the environment, there's adjudicators, there's all the things to make it exactly the same. 4 or 5 years or however spaced out the Olympics are, the conditions are exactly the same or as much as we can. Life is not like that. Business is not like that. So while goals work great in formulaic work with predictable outcomes, they're not so good for complex environments, ambiguity, change. And so therefore, a quest disposition, instead of working towards a clear promise, we work from a clear premise. We have an understanding that our defaults aren't necessarily serving us, and we're aware that choosing to not choose to do anything about it is a choice, and that has implications. We're not comfortable with those implications. We have enough constructive discontent to justify questing, and then we search. And part of that process of searching is cultivating a quiver of options, like if you're a surfer, or I don't know what the equivalent board riding thing in your land is, snowboarding or whatever it is.
We're surfing. We have surfing in Ireland actually, so surfing's quite
great.
Growing.
Amazing, cool.
Yeah.
So the idea is, like, if you're a surfer. And if you have at least 3 boards, one could say you have a quiver of boards, which means that you can look at the surf conditions and choose the right board appropriate to the conditions. And what we want to do in business is have a quiver of options. We want to have a healthy, dynamic, generative quiver of options. So these are strategic initiatives we might choose to invest in should the conditions manifest. Most, of course, don't have time to think, let alone cultivate a quiver of options. And so therefore, when change happens, they're completely unprepared for it, and they get incredibly disrupted and then wake up to find they're no longer relevant. But this process of questing, it's not, let's get in an external consultant with the answers to tell us what to do. It's not, let's just scan the zeitgeist for what ideas are hot right now and do that. It's literally doing the research, doing the stuff yourself, like actually sensing into the space. Sure, you might bring external thinkers in to stimulate good thinking. There's a point that I'm making here is that I find that because large organizations are so busy and everyone's busy and the leaders are busy, there's this dependency on bringing in consulting firms to do the thinking for them. Now, when you consult with consulting firms, they have the same issue internally themselves. They're so busy, their business model works on like getting consultants farmed out there. And so you have this whole interconnected web of these people that are all too busy to think. And the key thing is, well, we can cultivate a space to think. We can actually try to... Sorry, I'm getting carried away.
Please.
There's an important thing here.
You're on a quest, man.
This is leaders... if you're going to do this, you actually need to value it. You need to actually pay people well as well. Like you can't, I feel like there's this thing with like, we're in this phase at the moment where resilience is like one of the key terms. Like organizations are wanting their people to be resilient. And I had a brief the other day, well, about a month ago, I was like, oh, our people are really overworked at the moment and many are burning out. Can you do a resilience webinar for me? And it's just,
that'll help.
It's not going to cut it. Like we need to actually invest in this stuff for it to work. And if we do, and if we actually start Quest, the quality of the intelligence that can be generated within an organization or a team, and the kind of the significance of the decisions that are made in terms of meaningful progress, you just can't compare it. So yeah, that's.
I love it, man.
Long story short, that's questing.
Yeah, I love it. And you reminded me there. I worked with a team, and it was a finance team. So the finance team came up with a way that saved them a massive day a week. So they came up with a new process that saved them and the entire organization a day a week. Right? You know what they got rewarded with? More work. So it was like we've freed up this kind of energy and money for the organization. It's like, great, now you can do this. It wasn't like now you can explore and quest and find other ways you can do it and find efficiencies.
Yep.
And that's exactly back to your point. Let's keep going with the book, because why I keep coming back to language is the power of language. And it's funny, the language you used at the start, I went into some of the mental models I had existing, such as I loved classical studies when I was in school. I did it even though I didn't have the capacity to actually get tested for it, so I couldn't take the subject, but I actually went to the classes and read the Odyssey, etc. So I went into that mindset, and then I added in Clash of the Titans, those movies I saw growing up, and that's the lens through which I read the book. But one of and I just thought about the power of language to do that, and just, peppering the book with those languages, with the language you used, and then the images as well, done by you and Kim, were so powerful. But one of the ones that comes up time and time again, and I shared this with a group of change makers that I know, and it resonated so strongly, was, I've read it, and it's clear you've read it, Joseph Campbell's work, and the idea of the hero with 1,000 faces. And here you introduce the idea of the change maker as a hero, the monomyth that exists. So the structure is so common throughout so many quests that change makers are on. I'd love if you'd share this and unpack this, because this will resonate so strongly with some of our listeners.
Yeah. So Joseph Campbell's The Monomyth. Again, it's one of those things that after I wrote it, there's other structures as well that are equally compelling. So just as an aside, the narrative or mythological structure of many of Studio Ghibli's films, Japanese animation studio, is really quite wonderful. It's often female protagonists. There's no kind of clear resolution, but there's it's a different and equally valid story approach. But the monomyth is something that many of us are familiar with. And the basic premise, I'm going to do a crude summary, is the protagonist is in the ordinary world, surrounded by ordinary people doing ordinary things. There's a call to adventure. They ignore the call to adventure. Things change in the ordinary world. Think of Frodo and, stuff going on with the ring and stuff like that. A wizard or a catalyst appears and they serve as a call to adventure. This time it is taken up. And the hero, unfortunately in most tales it's a boy with a sword, but we can actually expand that to be much more inclusive nowadays. The hero must conquer the dragon, which is an external force, but ultimately then needs to pass the second threshold, which is like the demon, which is an inner journey of themselves. And then the third threshold, which then ultimately sees them return back to the ordinary world, but they are changed. And partly this process of going on a quest, and the times that I have done this with organizations that have done this very well, which is usually an investment of at least 18 months and time and a mix of a core team, and that's freshed up with secondments. You have this situation where people start, but then by the time they've actually gone back to their normal roles, they're all changed. They have a different perspective. They have newfound savvy and connections that they didn't have before. Like these quests aren't linear. They're not easy, and they have to very often, I mean, most quests are actually terrible and arduous. Like it's just, you wouldn't necessarily wish a quest upon someone based upon most of the stories and myths, but they are transformative. And so, yeah, Joseph Campbell's work is phenomenal. Once you start getting into mythology, all this stuff is just incredible. Like I'm a big fan of Hermes or Mercury, the trickster god, of messages and transitions and how that shows up in different, and the different archetypes. So archetypes are kind of character patterns and how they turn up in stories. And then the archetypal roles that we can play. These are fun. There's a danger sometimes when we rarefy them and make them too much of a thing. But if we kind of keep them in this kind of playful dynamic, they can be super generative and inclusive and offer new ways or new lenses, new ways of seeing things that we might otherwise not be able to see.
So I want to mirror that to real life examples. So real life, modern day life, call it that, modern day quest or modern day hero. So an executive goes to a conference. Somebody says something at a conference. She sees the world differently. Then she starts to see evidence for this maybe new competitor coming up, etc. Then goes back to the organization, starts to tell a few people. There's some action. It's like, let's get together. Let's talk about this. They come together. They have a strategic meeting. She goes on a quest to try and get to the CEO and get an earful, get an audience. And oftentimes that's the quest. And then you get the audience, the CEO, you might get the boardroom, you present, you're like, you got 10 minutes, kid, right? So you sit down, with your slide, you try and tell your story. And oftentimes, it reminds me of the movies where you get to what you think is a safe haven. And actually, that's the Kraken of Doom, the CEO. So the CEO pulls out a saber and lops off your head, and you're going, God damn it, I thought I'd made it to the top. So it's like, I call these Disney queue effects, where you think you're at the top of the Disneyland queue, and then it's like, oh no, there's a corner, and it goes all the way around again.
Yeah.
And you're right. It's snakes and ladders, man, and this, unfortunately, is what happens so many change makers and organizations. I'm sure you've seen this.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's nice to frame it in the real world. So I would say this person who is on a quest, the thing is, in the hero's journey, she's probably ignored that, like, it's this conference that's actually the call to adventure. It might be the fourth or fifth time that she's seen the idea. And all the other times she's thought, this is rubbish, or I shouldn't. And this is where we've got to get attuned to inklings and hunches, where we actually have this intuitive sense that, I think this is important. And then we get busy and distracted, and then nothing happens. And then you see it again. I think this is really important. And then, same thing happens. But then say there's a conference and something happens. Call to adventure. She's on. She goes there. She tries to rally it up. I don't know. I like, there's this format in video games where you're this little character and you go up and you go to the first boss and you just get beaten hugely, and then you wake up in this other land, and that boss that absolutely tranced you, I'm not talking boss in terms of leadership, I'm talking about video
game boss,
it's still there, right? But then the real quest begins, because you realize, of course, it's not going to work in a 10-minute meeting out of the blue, because that's the first time they've heard of the idea and they're busy too. So then you start having to get clever. How do we actually create a little bit of a conspiracy? How can I win over other folks? How can we start to garner some evidence for this? How can we build some case or momentum for this? And the reality is, the life of a change maker is often lonely and very unrewarding, and takes a long time to be an internal change agent. But the ones that do it well usually rally folks together. And usually what it looks like is a few folks sticking around for, meeting up early for coffee or something, or sticking around a little bit to just share and compare notes. And through that kind of collaborative cultivation of seniors, some interesting things can emerge, and it's quite possible that executives can actually rally meaningful change. It just doesn't happen in a straight line.
You know what came to mind? You know that scene, the iconic scene from Jerry Maguire's like, "Who's with me?" And he grabs the goldfish. And then
Yeah, yeah.
she eventually, you know, one person comes with him and is like, "We're off on a quest." But
Yeah.
back
That's
to
right.
the story arc. We're not going to get through it all, but I found something really really helpful. And you say mathematician George Box once said, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." And it's with this humility that you present your own quest augmented strategy, a framework for meaningful progress. I found this really really helpful. So, Jason, let's share that for those who are with us on YouTube, who are watching this on YouTube. You will see it. Maybe we'll use some empathy then, Jason, for those people who aren't watching it, because most of our audience are actually listeners. So I'm going to share this Quest Augmented Strategy. There we go. That should be up on the screen for everybody to see.
Right, so for folks listening, it's a bloody quadrant model. I mean, every consultant's got their quadrant model, and I guess I'm no different, but this one's got some flair. So on the vertical axis, we've got thinking and doing, thinking at the top, doing at the bottom. I think that's a false dichotomy. A lot of thinking actually happens whilst doing and vice versa, but for the sake of the model, it's useful to separate these things out. Then we have on the horizontal axes, on the left-hand side, we have operational. And on the right-hand side, we have pioneering. So when we're talking about operational, we're talking about working within certainty. And with pioneering, we're working in a space of uncertainty. So the pioneering thing, I think about the distinction between pioneers versus settlers. So pioneers explore the land, think, okay, where might be a good place? And the settlers come in to lands that's already been explored and start to build buildings and settle down. So on the left-hand side, we have the operational land. This is where strategy has occurred, and most folks spend 98% of their time here. Strategy is informed by a combination of default thinking and incrementalism and a bit of bandwagonism. So leaders will scan the zeitgeist for whatever buzzword is hot and just tack it on to their existing default modus operandi. And then you get a kind of progress that happens. I'm not sure if it's meaningful progress, but there's a progress that happens. On the other side, you have options and experiments. And this is all on a distinction between a mission-orientated thing, which is missions are great. Missions working towards a clear promise where you have narrowed focus, usually within tight time parameters. And then you have quests on the other side, which are much more open, where you are working from a clear premise and you don't necessarily have tight parameters. You have a more qualitative bias than quantitative. And at the top right of this quadrant model, we have options. This is where we get the quiver of options that I was talking about before. The point of quests is to enrich the quiver of options that we have. We want to expand the possible options that are in our possibility space. I'm not talking about necessarily infinitely, considering all possible options. There's a curation to this. We're building a quiver of options because ultimately we're seeing if there are any viable alternative options to the default ways of doing things. The only way we can tell if an option is viable or not is by conducting experiments. So this is where we look at our quiver of options, we monitor the context that we're in, and then we might... I can give an example from a client that I worked with about 5 years ago because this is... time's passed and most of my work is on non-disclosure agreements. So it's actually really hard to talk about what most of I do. But here, there was a client that was realizing that, flexibility in the workplace is going to be a thing. The notion that employers own employees' time is pretty dated and is likely to change. We want to see if it's possible for our employees to self-regulate and essentially organize scheduling and rostering themselves. And this was a contact center that was exploring that. So they knew when they had peak demand, they knew when they had to have people on board, and they wanted to experiment. Is it possible for the team itself to self-organize around this? And so there were a few options within that were building into this experiment. They conducted an experiment with a small pilot study, seemed to yield results. They then expanded that to a bigger pilot study, and then it was integrated into strategic decision-making, and thus a more meaningful kind of progress was attained. That's the Quest Augmented Strategy model. It's not that linear. It's all over the place in reality, but it's a useful frame to think about how quests can enrich and enhance the strategic decision-making that happens within an enterprise.
So I love that. I think it's so helpful, and thanks for letting me share it there. back to non-linear, because none of this is linear. And I loved what you said about the Olympics, and I was thinking that if you think about the Olympics, it's a set ground. It's understood. They've actually agreed all the sports that are going to take place. And actually, as a change maker, the quest is usually, hey, I got this quiver of new sports that I've been testing out here. I think this one could actually work in the Olympics. And that journey, for anybody who's listening, if there's the chance that somebody's listening who introduced a new sport to the Olympics, I'm sure it's absolutely hell. And I say hell because you introduced
skateboarding into the Olympics. Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You definitely are no Pollyanna about the approach here. It's non-linear. It's all over the place. It's like introducing a new sport to the Olympics, and it's difficult. And you introduce here the 9 layers of hell that we have to get through. It's like, this ain't easy. You have to go through hell literally in order to get there. I love this, and we won't go through all 9 layers, but perhaps you'll give us a high-level view of this.
Well, yeah, that particular model was just because I speak at a lot of conferences and events. I know you do the same too, and you start to see there's just the same memes and tropes and things that get repeated. And one of the things I saw a lot was we need to celebrate failure. I even wrote about it in my first book. But I was like, that's a little bit, it's just starting to get a bit tacky. And there are some kinds of failure that we don't want to celebrate, like immoral actions or systemic negligence like that. We don't want to celebrate that. So it was useful to kind of have this spectrum of what, like a failed experiment. Yeah, maybe there's some good learnings out of that or things like that. There's a kind of a spectrum of what failure looks like. And so, this was more to just mollify what we want people that are on quests is we want to get them out of binary thinking. We don't want them to think in mission mode of success and failure. We want them to see everything's on a spectrum. There's all gradients. It's all relative. And to realize that if we're working with the best of intent towards meaningful progress, there's going to be hiccups along the way, and it's not going to be smooth sailing, but that's okay. And there are some, of course, failures that we don't want to celebrate, but then there's a lot that's just learning, and it's just how we go through it. That was the intent with that model in the book.
I love that model. And by the way, just for our listeners, so much, because I was saying to Jason before we came on air, he did such a great job of going so wide, but also keeping you on the journey, the story arc, and making it so enjoyable. It's such an enjoyable read, illustrated beautifully as well. But I thought a great way to finish, and it's such an important thing. I mentioned to you about the pins. We talked about that earlier on. The pin is a ritual for me. So it's almost like putting on my suit in order to get ready for the show, selecting the pin, etc., etc. That ritual's kind of become important to me. And you emphasize the importance of rituals in organizations. It's this huge part of the how for organizations. How do you get there? But also for those individuals who are looking to change their lives in some meaningful way.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just reflecting back on your example of the, I think, finance group that saved folks effectively a day a week. And what happened instead, how was that rewarded? It was just given more work. And this is the pattern that happens in organizations, that anytime you're innovative or clever and you do things in a way that's actually more effective with time, your reward is more work. And so that does either two things. It either encourages people to, I guess, rise to their level of incompetence and just do things mediocre, or to have busy people, highly effective people burn out because they just attract more and more work. What's missing is the rituals. And I remember in some of my earlier jobs when I was working at the university, or just in hearing stories of other people's, it used to be that people would have, these are pre-COVID times I'm talking about, people would have like these rituals where once a week they'd meet for a morning tea, and cake would be shared and updates would be shared, or they'd have a beer at the end of the week together, knock off early on a Friday, or they'd do things, once a month have a game of cricket or whatever, some sort of sport thing. They'll do things that allow time and space to connect, to reflect, to have, so it's not constantly busy and productive all the time. But this curse of productivity and efficiency that's engulfed us has meant that a lot of these meaningful rituals that in many ways are like canary in the coal mines, these early indicators that something's... What do I mean by this? In your own life, all of us as individuals, we can think about some of the things that we do each day that are really important for us. Like, I have a morning journaling ritual that I'd like to say I do a lot of the time, but if I think about this year, actually, it's been a little bit shaky. It's interesting now. I'm just realizing in real time that what I usually say is, there are these things like going for a walk in the evening or things that we do that if we stop doing them because we become too busy, they're early indicators that something's not quite right. This is an important ritual here. Like for you with the pin and getting, that's a centering ritual that gets you kind of in the mode for the podcast. It's a different way of being. There's a presencing and a centering. But, imagine there's a scenario where your kid spilt milk on the way here, you're running a little bit late, Zoom's done an update and stuff that you haven't had a chance to get, that if that was gone, that's an early indicator. Hang on, something's not quite right. Are we in the right space here? Is this right? And so, again, there's thinking about enterprise. There are, conferences, for example. Most conferences or most events are just junked up with or bloated with all this content, but really what it is a chance for people to connect with each other. They've been working all year. As a ritual, it's vital. Rituals are like sacred routines where we deliberately carve out time against the grain of busyness to progress the things that matter. They're the time that we dedicate to the things that don't necessarily fit in boxes, or the things that, that allow space for us to reflect or ask the questions that don't normally get a chance to be asked. And so in How to Lead a Quest, I try to encourage people to think about rituals. This links to, time to think. It links to reading books. It links to a lot of things. And I just, if everyone listening to this right now were to think about their life, think about it through the lens of daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, yearly, decade, if you want. What are the rituals that you have in place that really help to ensure you're making meaningful progress? Because they're usually the last bastions against the default thinking and the curse of efficiency that end up consuming us day to day. And if we don't honor our rituals, what happens is we become so busy, we get burnt out, and then we turn to distraction. So we numb ourselves with Netflix or other things, and we never really address the things that need to be addressed. So yeah, rituals. I think rituals are super important.
Super important. I thought it's a great exercise for our audience to do, is to examine that, write down the rituals, write what rituals have fallen by the wayside, what ones do they want to put in place for maybe preparing for next year. But also I thought a lovely way to maybe final exercise, one that you use with your corporate workshops when you have time, is the idea of one word. That I love this idea, choose one word ritual. And you mentioned, I introduced you as the arch wizard. I'm guessing wizard is maybe the ritual at the moment, is the word you've chosen at the moment, because I thought that was very powerful, and I've peppered that throughout today's show, is the idea of the power of language, because language is how we think. And I thought that's such a powerful thing for people to do on a personal level, because choosing a word and living along with that word. And you told us in the book, you wrote in 2016, the word you chose at the time was pirate. And I just wanted to recommend, if you haven't read it, he's a former guest on the show, a guy called Sam Conniff, and his book is called Be More Pirate. It's absolutely wonderful.
It's so good.
Wonderful book, yeah. So anyway, Sam was a former guest on the show. Just maybe a word on this, and maybe give our audience an instruction of what to do to embrace this idea.
Okay. All right. So, wizard was a word for me. It's been integrated. This is currently the year of the hermit, which is very much inspired by the...
For obvious reasons, man.
Yeah, well, actually, I struggled this year for the first year. I've been doing it for about 11 years now. But yeah, hermit's the thing. I've needed to go more inward than ever before. I have if you don't mind me doing a slight plug, I have a course dedicated to this, chooseoneword.com. Chooseoneword.com, over 70 video lessons on how to choose one word. It's not necessarily easy. The short thread of it is that instead of choosing a goal or setting a resolution for yourself, you can do this at any time. By the way, I previously did it around my birthday, but I've switched it to April Fool's Day being the genesis. I know some people that do it on equinoxes or solstices. You can choose whenever you want to embark upon this ritual. The point is, instead of setting a goal for yourself, which has all the issues we talked about beforehand, instead, after much reflection and introspection, where you recognize the patterns that you have in yourself, where you recognize, if you were to think about your life as an autobiography, where every single moment leading up to this moment right now has been written down in this big book. And if you were to look at the last few years, I wonder, what themes do you see? What patterns do you see? And if you were to think about, where you are in the next 12 months, I wonder what themes or, what do you want to see emerge? If you were to give the next 12 months, next 12 chapters, one word to serve almost as a fuzzy contextual beacon, as a guiding, you could call it a North Star if you want, one word to cast 12 months into the future to serve as a guiding light, so that should you wander off track, and you will, we all do, it might just serve you to remind you what's important for you. I wonder what that word might be. And there are archetype words, there's active words, there's aspect words, there's abstract words, there's all sorts of words that you can choose, and there's a method to that. I've had the year of the fool, the year of the jester, the year of the pirate, the year of the gentleman, the year of wizard. There's been a bunch of words. It's a fun activity, but it's a gateway to much introspection and insight. And it's been, I receive letters from people, handwritten letters that they write about this process, so it's quite lovely.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So we're coming to the end of the show, and I was going to ask you where can people find you? You run workshops, you are a Sherpa for many organizations as they embark on quests. You help them build quivers of options. Where can people find you to engage you in that work? You also mentioned the other website, One Word. Maybe you just give a replug for those.
Sure. So I hope it's that one word. Chooseoneword.com is the ritual of becoming, or you can go to cleverness.com/word. And my website's at drjasonfox.com. So that's drjasonfox.com. And probably the main thing I do is I write a newsletter. I have about 11,000 folks who subscribe to my newsletter. It's an organically grown list of curious folks who like to keep up to date with my latest thinking. And so you can find that on my website.
Brilliant. And thanks to the book, I'm also a subscriber to the newsletter. And I've unsubscribed from so many, man, over the last while. So I have a final quote. It's my way of just recognizing your work, etc. I'd love if then you'd finish today's show with your final message to our audience. The reason you do this, because there's a deeper reason you do this. I'm sure during your hermit year, you've gone and looked at this, etc. I'd love if you'd finish on that, but I'll give this final quote, and it really encapsulates everything for me, including the pin that says, it says, do more than just exist on a backpack. So here's what the final quote for me is, and this is from your book, How to Lead a Quest. Get born, go to school, go to university, get a job, save up for a wedding, get married, switch jobs, save up for a house, get a mortgage, have a kid, switch jobs, work hard, get a promotion, take a holiday, have a second kid, work harder, see kids through university, get another promotion, have a midlife crisis, recover, work hard, retire, go on a holiday, settle down, look after the grandkids, and die. Of course, that's just the default template. There is always a better way. My final word from today. What about you, Jason?
That's good. I'll quote my favorite philosopher, James Cass, the author of Finite and Infinite Games, A Vision of Life as Play and Possibility. He says, only that which can change can continue. I love that. There's one more quote. Finite players play within boundaries. Infinite players play with boundaries. And I would suggest that most of the people listening to this are of a more infinite disposition. They're looking for the boundaries to play with. That's why they're listening to innovation, the work that you do. And so I would just encourage, look for those I'm going to give one more quote, actually, because this one always works for me too. This one comes from Andrew Ryan. He's the CEO and founder of Rapture, an underwater city in a game called BioShock. He says, "We all make choices, but in the end, our choices make us." And I just want to say thank you to everyone who's chosen to invest their time to listen to this. It's wonderful. It's shaping who you are, it's shaping who we are, and I'm very grateful. And thank you also for inviting me on the show. Yeah.
Oh, absolute pleasure. And thank you for your contribution, author of How to Lead a Quest, a handbook for pioneering executives, the arch wizard of ambiguity, and the hermit, Dr. Jason Fox. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, mate.